On the moonlit night of March 22, 1945, General George S. Patton stood on the banks of the Rhine, watching his Third Army slide silently into the black water. No artillery, no air support, just a desperate gamble to humiliate a British field marshal. But behind the bravado lay a secret that would nearly end his career. Was Patton fighting for victory or for a personal obsession that transcended the war itself? The Rhine River was not just a geographic barrier in the spring of 1945, it was a psychological wall that had protected the German heartland for centuries. To the men of the United States Third Army, it represented the final hurdle in a grueling race across Europe that had begun in the hedgerows of Normandy. But for Lieutenant General George S. Patton, the river was a stage for a high-stakes drama where the supporting actors were legendary figures like Dwight D. Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and his bitter rival, Bernard Law Montgomery. As March began, the Third Army was a finely tuned engine of destruction, a force of 320,000 men organized into 3 corps, including 4 armored divisions that had spent the winter bleeding in the Ardennes. Patton knew that the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAF, was funneling the lion's share of resources to Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the north for Operation Plunder. Why, Patton wondered, was the master of caution being given the glory while the master of speed was being told to adopt a posture of aggressive defense? He paced his headquarters, a man possessed by the ticking clock of history. He had spent months stockpiling assault boats and bridging equipment since August 1944, hiding them from the prying eyes of Allied planners who might have diverted them to the British front. Before the Rhine could be conquered, the Rhineland had to be cleared. This was Operation Undertone, a converging hammer blow designed to crush the German 1st and 7th Armies in the Saar-Palatinate Triangle. Patton's armor slashed through the Eifel Mountains while Alexander Patch's 7th Army pushed from the south. It was a massacre of logistics. The 19th Tactical Air Command worked in such tight synchronicity with Patton's tanks that German columns were often obliterated before they could even deploy. By March 20th, the 10th Armored Division had reached Kaiserslautern, and the German defense was a shattered mirror of its former self. Over 100,000 German soldiers were killed or captured in just 10 days. Yet even as the Rhineland fell, a common historical misconception persists that the Allied crossing of the Rhine was a singular, massive effort led by Montgomery. In reality, the silent crossing at Oppenheim was an act of tactical rebellion that shattered German morale weeks before the northern offensive reached its peak. Patton was not just crossing a river, he was dismantling the Sh-F hierarchy. He turned to Omar Bradley and insisted that they must move now before the Germans could catch their breath. Bradley, often the calm mediator to Patton's fire, knew that the First Army's capture of the Remagen Bridge on March 7th had opened a door, but Patton wanted to kick the entire wall down. The strategy was simple but terrifyingly risky, a night assault with no preliminary bombardment. On March 22nd at 2200 hours, the 11th Infantry Regiment of the 5th Infantry Division stepped into assault boats operated by the 204th Engineer Combat Battalion. They moved in total darkness, the only sound being the rhythmic dip of oars and the distant rumble of the front. The Germans at Nierstein were so completely caught off guard that the first wave of Americans literally found them in their pajamas. 7 startled Germans surrendered and paddled themselves across the river to the American side, an event so surreal it felt like a rehearsal rather than a historic invasion. But at Oppenheim, the reception was different. Machine gun fire began to stitch patterns across the water as the first boats reached the halfway point. Patton didn't care about the fire, he cared about the bridge. By the next morning, the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion was already constructing a 366-meter floating treadway bridge. It was completed in just 18 hours. While Montgomery was still counting his artillery shells and preparing his smoke screens, Patton's tanks were already rumbling onto the eastern bank. Patton's reaction to the success was vintage. He famously stopped on the Treadway Bridge and, in a gesture of ultimate contempt for the last natural barrier of the Reich, he relieved himself into the Rhine. He told the soldiers around him it was the pause that refreshes. He then called Bradley and practically shouted through the receiver, "For God's sake, tell the world we're across. I want the world to know the Third Army made it before Monty starts his grand show." This wasn't just about military science, it was about the personal ego of a man who believed he was the reincarnation of a Roman legionnaire. But as the Third Army fanned out across central Germany, a shadow was growing. Patton's aggression was starting to outpace his intelligence. He was pushing toward the heart of Bavaria, driven by reports of a national redoubt in the Alps, where Hitler and his fanatical SS would supposedly make a final, suicidal stand. Intelligence officers warned him that the redoubt might be a myth, a piece of Nazi propaganda designed to lure the Allies into a trap. Did Patton believe the myth, or did he simply need an excuse to keep moving? By the end of March, the Third Army was capturing 10,000 prisoners a day. The German First Army's right wing had collapsed, leaving a gaping void between Nuremberg and the Czech border. Patton saw an opening to slash southeast, following the Danube Valley toward Austria. However, Eisenhower and Bradley were already looking at the post-war map. They were worried about the political fallout of Patton's erratic behavior. The tension reached a boiling point when Patton ordered the Hammelburg raid. On March 26th, he sent Task Force Bomb, a small armored column of 300 men, 60 miles behind enemy lines. Officially, it was to liberate a POW camp. Unofficially, everyone in the staff room knew that Patton's son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, was being held there. Major General Manton Eddy and Brigadier General William Hogue both protested, calling the mission a wild goose chase that would result in needless death. Patton overruled them all. He told Hogue that he had cleared a name that remains one of the great historical ambiguities of the campaign. Imagine for a moment if Task Force Bomb had succeeded without a hitch. Patton might have been seen as a humanitarian hero, the man who saved his family and his soldiers with one daring stroke. Instead, the reality was a catastrophe. The column was shadowed by a German spotter plane and eventually surrounded by veteran NCOs from the German Infantry Combat School. Only 35 men made it back. All 57 vehicles were lost. Patton's gamble had failed, and for the first time, his superiors began to look at him not as a brilliant maverick, but as a dangerous liability. Bradley would later say that failure itself was George's own worst reprimand, but Patton was already moving on to his next obsession, the liberation of the concentration camps. As the 4th Armored Division pushed into Thuringia on April 4th, they stumbled upon Ohrdruf. It was the first time Western Allied troops had seen the machinery of the Holocaust. The air was thick with the smell of death and wet blood. The discovery of Ohrdruf shattered Patton's iron exterior. This was a man who had seen thousands of corpses on the battlefield, yet the sight of emaciated bodies piled like cordwood in a shed made him physically ill. He vomited behind a barracks and wept. He immediately ordered Eisenhower and Bradley to visit the camp on April 12th. He wanted them to see what they were fighting against. It was a pivotal moment where the war changed from a strategic conquest to a moral crusade. Patton's Third Army after-action reports from this period are cold and clinical, detailing territory captured and prisoners processed, but his private letters reveal a man grappling with a sudden, horrifying clarity. He ordered the local German population to walk through the camp, forcing them to look at the crimes committed in their name. The mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife went home that night and hanged themselves. As the Third Army reached the gateway to Bavaria, the operational synergy between Patton and Alexander Patch's 7th Army became critical. The Battle of Nuremberg from April 16th to 20th was a brutal street-to-street fight. While Patch's men cleared the city of the rallies, Patton's 12th Corps exploited the gap created by the city's isolation, racing toward the Czech border. On April 15th, Eisenhower issued a formal order redirecting Patton's entire army southeast. The mission: clear the Danube Valley and prevent any Nazi regrouping in the Alps. This was the final sweep. The 65th Infantry Division made the first crossing of the Danube at Regensburg on April 29th, a northern stronghold of Hitler's supposed redoubt. The logistics of this advance were staggering. Patton's supply lines now stretched nearly 500 miles back to the French coast. The Army Service Forces were delivering thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition daily, yet Patton was still complaining that his tanks were being rationed. He believed that if he were given total priority, he could reach Berlin before the Soviets. But Eisenhower had already decided that Berlin was a political prize not worth the American lives it would cost to take it. Patton's frustration grew as he was ordered to halt at the Czech border, leaving Prague to the Red Army. He saw the Soviets not as allies, but as the next enemy. He warned Bradley that if they didn't stop the Mongol hordes now, they would have to fight them later. By May 5th, the 11th Armored Division had reached the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. This was the dark climax of the Bavarian campaign. The soldiers found thousands of living skeletons, victims of a regime that had specialized in destruction through labor. The 131st Evacuation Hospital was deployed to stabilize the survivors, but for many the help came too late. Typhus was rampant. Patton's troops had traveled farther than any other army in Europe, captured 1.2 million prisoners, and liberated territory that would soon become the focal point of the Cold War. But as the guns fell silent on May 8th, Patton's greatest challenge was just beginning. He was appointed the military governor of Bavaria, a role that required a diplomat, not a warrior. In the ruins of Munich, Patton began to rebuild. He was obsessed with efficiency. He wanted the lights turned back on and the water running. To do this, he began employing former low-level Nazis in administrative roles. His logic was simple. The Nazis were the only ones who knew how to run the bureaucracy. But this was a direct violation of the Shay-F denazification policy. Eisenhower was furious. He reminded Patton that they were there to destroy the Nazi Party, not to use it. Patton countered that the Soviets were the real threat, and that a strong, rebuilt Germany was the only buffer against communism. He was right about the Cold War, but he was decades early, and his lack of tact was becoming a political nightmare for Washington. The final blow came in September 1945. During a press conference, Patton was goaded by reporters into discussing the denazification controversy. He brandished his riding crop and compared the Nazi Party to the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States. It was the headline that broke the camel's back. Eisenhower, who had saved Patton's career multiple times before, could no longer ignore the damage. On October 8, 1945, Patton was relieved of his command of the Third Army. He was transferred to the 15th Army, a paper headquarters responsible for writing the history of the war. He was a general without a battle, a king without a country. His final months were spent in bitterness. He wrote his memoirs, War as I Knew It, and continued to attack Eisenhower in his private diaries. He saw his removal as a betrayal by a friend who was bitten by the presidential bug. He was convinced that the world would soon realize he was right about the Soviet threat. On December 9, 1945, while on his way to a pheasant hunt, his staff car was struck by a truck near Mannheim. He suffered a broken neck and was paralyzed from the neck down. He fought for 12 days in a hospital in Heidelberg before his heart finally gave out. The man who had survived the lead and steel of 2 world wars was killed by a simple traffic accident. Patton's legacy is a complex web of brilliance and tragedy. He was the most aggressive panzer general the Allies ever produced, a man who improved on Napoleon's tenets of speed and activity. His crossing of the Rhine at Oppenheim remains a textbook example of how tactical surprise can overcome a superior defensive position. His sweep through Bavaria destroyed the last remnants of the Third Reich and revealed to the world the full horror of the concentration camps. But his personal demons and political ignorance ensured that his post-war career would be as short as it was controversial. He was a man built for war, and in the peace that followed, he had no place left to go. The story of the Third Army in 1945 is not just about a general, it is about the thousands of engineers who built bridges in 18 hours, the pilots who generated 3,000 sorties a month, and the infantrymen who saw the worst of humanity and still kept moving forward. It was a victory of industrial might and individual courage. Patton was the conductor of this massive, violent orchestra, but the music belonged to the men in the foxholes. As we look back at the drive to Bavaria, we must ask, was the cost of Patton's ego worth the speed of the victory? Or did his relentless drive save lives that would have been lost in a longer, more methodical war? The strategic pillars of Patton's success were simple: speed, intelligence advantage, and a refusal to accept the impossible. He used the oblique approach, pinning the enemy with infantry while his armor executed deep penetrations into the rear. He didn't care about holding territory, he cared about destroying the enemy's main force. This philosophy allowed him to clear 81,000 square miles of territory in less than a year. But this same philosophy made him an outcast in a world that was moving toward bureaucratic stability. He was the last of the classical commanders, a man who belonged to an age of swords and horses, even as he led a force of tanks and planes. If the Nazis had truly prepared a fortress in the Alps, the war might have dragged on for another year. Patton's drive into Bavaria was designed to head off this threat, and in doing so, he captured the industrial heart of southern Germany. But by mid-April, it was clear the redoubt was largely a fantasy. The German soldiers Patton's men encountered in Bavaria were often old men and young boys, the last resort of a dying regime. The Third Army was no longer fighting a military force, they were cleaning up a wreckage. At Moosburg on April 30th, the Third Army liberated Stalag 7A, freeing 100,000 Allied prisoners of war. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy in a campaign defined by horror. For the men of the Third Army, this was the ultimate validation of their sacrifice. They crossed the Rhine, endured the Ardennes, and fought through the Bavarian forest to bring these men home. Patton, despite his controversies, had led them there. He was their old blood and guts, a man they loved and feared in equal measure. Let's look at the numerical analysis of the Third Army's impact. They killed, wounded, or captured 1.8 million enemy soldiers. They suffered 139,000 casualties of their own. For every American lost, 12 Germans were neutralized. These are not just dry facts, they are a testament to the efficiency of Patton's command. He integrated the 19th Tactical Air Command into his ground operations so effectively that the Luftwaffe was virtually non-existent over his sector. Sorties in March 1945 reached a record 2,891, providing a canopy of steel for the tanks below. But what if Patton had been allowed to take Prague? The map of Europe today would look very different. He begged Bradley to let him push on, arguing that the political price of Eisenhower's refusal was a pragmatic decision based on current casualties, but Patton's foresight regarding the Cold War is undeniable. He saw the Iron Curtain falling before the term was even coined. His aggression was not just a personality trait, it was a strategic worldview that saw the end of one war as the beginning of the next. The Task Force bomb disaster remains the greatest stain on his tactical record. It was a mission born of personal emotion, and it cost the lives of men who had survived the worst the Wehrmacht could throw at them. Patton's attempt to classify the mission as top secret and his refusal to allow an investigation reveal a man who knew he had crossed a line. Captain Abraham Baum, who led the raid, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, but the medal was a hollow comfort for the loss of his command. Patton owed Baum, and he knew it. As the governor of Bavaria, Patton's failure was one of empathy. He could not understand why the world was so focused on the Nazi thing, when the Soviet threat was so much more immediate to him. He saw the reconstruction of Germany as a race against time. If the Germans didn't have food and coal, they would turn to the Russians. He was a combat commander trying to win a peace by the same rules he used for war. But peace has no flank to turn and no rear to kick. The tragedy of Patton's death is its banality. He wanted to die in battle, perhaps as the last man standing in a heroic charge. Instead, he died in a hospital bed, paralyzed and forgotten by the high command he had served so brilliantly. His transfer to the 15th Army was a slow death sentence for a man of his energy. He called it a historical section, where they were writing stuff no one would ever read. He was a warrior whose war had ended too soon. His funeral in Heidelberg was attended by the very generals who had relieved him. Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patch stood in silence as the most controversial general of the war was laid to rest. He was eventually moved to the Luxembourg American Cemetery, buried among his men of the Third Army just as he had requested. He remains one of the most studied and polarizing figures in military history. Was he a genius or a madman, a hero or a liability? Perhaps the answer lies in the speed of the Third Army's advance. They moved faster than any army in history, covering more ground and capturing more prisoners than any of their peers. Patton's doctrine of go forward was the engine that drove the Allied victory in the West. He was the man who understood that in modern war, momentum is the only thing that matters. Without Patton, the crossing of the Rhine might have taken months longer, and the liberation of the camps might have come too late for thousands more. Now, we resolve the mystery of the Hammelburg raid. It was not just about his son-in-law. Patton was also competing with Douglas MacArthur. He had heard about MacArthur's daring POW rescues in the Philippines and wanted to show that he could do better. He wanted to be the general of generals, a man who could win any battle on any front. His rivalry with Montgomery was only half the story. He was in a race with everyone, including his own legend. And what of the National Redoubt? It was revealed to be a desperate gamble by Joseph Goebbels to buy time. There were no underground fortresses, no fanatical divisions waiting in the peaks. Patton had chased a ghost, but in doing so, he had cleared the way for the occupation of southern Germany. His obsession with the redoubt was a mistake that accidentally produced a strategic masterstroke. The final fate of Patton's command after the war was one of total dissolution. The Third Army became an army of occupation, its teeth pulled and its spirit broken by the administrative boredom of governing a defeated nation. Patton's relief was the symbolic end of the fighting Third Army. The warrior was gone, and the bureaucrats had taken over. He died, knowing that the world he helped create was one he no longer understood. The Third Army's campaign in 1945 remains a masterpiece of operational art. From the silent boats at Oppenheim to the tanks at the Czech border, it was a display of American military maturity. Patton was the catalyst, the spark that ignited the engine. He was a man of his time, and when that time passed, so did he. But the bridges he built and the men he freed are his true monument. George S. Patton was a man who lived and died by the sword. His crossing of the Rhine and his march into Bavaria were the final acts of a life dedicated to the art of war. He was a general who led from the front, a commander who knew that victory is not found in plans but in execution. He was the Third Army, and the Third Army was him. Patton believed that the Allies should have pushed on to Berlin and Prague to stop the Soviet Union from occupying Eastern Europe. Do you think Eisenhower was right to stop him? Or was Patton's foresight about the Cold War a missed opportunity to change history? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.